Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. On behalf of Teamwork Arts and the British Library, we welcome you to the second last session of the virtual JLF London at the British Library, presented in partnership with the Aga Khan Foundation UK and our patron, the Murthy Family Foundation. Our magazine partner for this series is The Week, Journalism with a Human Touch. Our next session is Jikoni to the Chef's Table, Food and Creativity. Ravinder Bhogal, Asma Khan, and Vir Sanghi in conversation with Krishnendu Ray. Food holds a primal place in our emotions and identity, and spices and local flavors are an integral part of identity and culture. Award-winning food writer and restaurateur Ravinder Bhogal's new cookbook, Jikoni, Proudly Inauthentic Recipes from an Immigrant Kitchen, blends myriad cuisines and a heritage that crosses continents. Celebrated Indian-born British chef and restaurateur Asma Khan of Netflix's Chef's Table is the author of Darjeeling Express. Celebrated television anchor and India's leading food writer Vir Sanghi is the co-founder and lead critic of the online restaurant reservation platform Easy Diner. In conversation with the author and chair of the Department of Nutrition and Food Studies at NYU, Krishnendu Ray, Ravinder, Asma, and Vir Sanghi speak of food and creativity and the nature of the chef's craft. Ravinder Bhogal is an award-winning journalist, restaurateur, chef, and broadcaster. In 2016, she opened her first restaurant, Jikoni, gaining a place in the National Restaurant Awards within 6 months of opening. Her latest book is Jikoni, Proudly Inauthentic Recipes from an Immigrant Kitchen. Asma Khan opened her London restaurant Darjeeling Express in 2017 after running supper clubs and a pop-up. A year later, she published Asma's Indian Kitchen, winner of the Gourmand World Cookbook Award in the Indian cuisine category in the United Kingdom. Vir Sanghi is a columnist and TV presenter. He was formerly editor of the Hindustan Times. His published books include the best-selling Men of Steel and Mandate. His most recent book is The Game Changers. 2 collections of his food journalism have also been published. Rude Food won the Quantrill Prize for Best Food Literature Book in the World. Last year, Penguin published The Indian Pantry. Krishnendu Ray is the chair of the Department of Nutrition and Food Studies at NYU. He is the author of The Migrant Table, The Ethnic Restaurateur, and the co-editor of Curried Cultures, Globalization, Food, and South Asia. Our sessions are available to view on london.jlflitfest.org, on our Facebook page, JLF Litfest, and on our YouTube channel, Jaipur Litfest JLF. In case any of you drop off due to bandwidth issues, you can log back on. Please do ask questions and comment by typing in the comment section. We encourage and request you to help keep JLF London at the British Library a free festival by donating generously. And please do consider supporting the British Library for all the work they do. Ladies and gentlemen, Jikoni to the Chef's Table, Food and Creativity. Ravinder Bhogal, Asma Khan, and Vir Sanghi in conversation with Krishnendu Ray. Over to you, Krishnendu.
Hey, thanks a lot. Thanks a lot, Ankur, and welcome everyone. Let's in fact dive in. This will be a 35-minute session and 10 minutes of Q&A. And I'm looking forward to it. This is my kind of dream panel. I have read and cooked from many of your books. Ravinder, in fact, just yesterday, I made the quail. Did you see my Twitter feed?
Beautiful. I saw your Twitter, I saw your Instagram. I was really touched and it looked delicious.
Fantastic. And Asma, we go back now. We are like, last time we were in Jaipur together?
Yes, that's right.
Yeah.
We were on the panel together.
We were on the panel together, and that was kind of a lot of fun. I learned a lot. And Vir's books, both his Rude Food and the Indian Pantry, we use at NYU for one of the classes on food culture and globalization. So welcome, everyone. Welcome. Let's dive into Ravinder. I'll start off with you. Proudly inauthentic. Why?
Well, it just, the whole concept of the word authentic seems very constrictive to me from where I come from, because I'm an immigrant, and I have crossed many borders through many boundaries. And with each of those crossings, I've been influenced by so many cultures, by so many people who've shared their wisdom with me, who've given me hospitality, and that has fed into my food. And I think actually immigrants, especially when we arrive in a new place, we have both the ache for what we've left behind, but then the wonder of our new landscape. And we may not be able to get everything we were used to getting in our old land. And so we make do and we adapt with what we have in our new land. And I think in doing that, we're actually creating a completely new cuisine. And I think that's what immigrant food is. So I think it can always be proudly inauthentic. And I think, you can only ever be authentic to yourself. Your story can only be real to you.
Do you find, and I'll ask this question of Asma too, do you find being a woman, is that something to do with gender too, that the confinements of culture are more severe than say, than if you're gendered otherwise?
I think so. I think it depends what background you come from. I certainly found it with myself. There was an expectation, especially in the realm of cookery, that it seemed to be some sort of, I witnessed my mother, my aunts, grandmother, sisters, all joining this sort of cult of domesticity. Mm-hmm. And there was an expectation that you would just cook. And I remember my mother particularly saying to me, you will cook, and you will cook for your husband, and you will cook for your children. And it's only really when I moved to England and I saw around me so many incredible women, from people like Madhur Jaffrey, Nigella Lawson, all of these women making a career out of food, that I didn't dare to dream that might be me. There was this subconscious thing that, yes, I love to cook, I love food, and this is something I dream of, but I thought it was far out of my reach. And it's only when, many years later, when I was working as a journalist, that sort of opportunity presented itself to me in the flesh. But yeah, certainly, I think you may not be given the same opportunities.
Asma, you have almost inverted that. Your kitchen has only women, right? Is that correct?
Yes, that's right. Yeah.
Does it make a difference? Why only women? And in some ways, do you find this confinement of culture and a gendered body particularly confining, or have you turned it around and turned it into a site of power?
I have turned it around because I've made it something where this is the platform from which I speak. My power comes from being a woman, but also comes from being a home cook. But the thing is that, I don't speak just for myself. I'm the voice of the voiceless. All those dadis, nanis, halas, ammis who cooked and were never celebrated. I am that face. I am their voice. And this is where it is very important for me to cook and celebrate the food that they made. In my kitchen, I have, 9. Now we will actually have 9 working full time because I've got a bigger kitchen. 9 home cooks who have now also discovered, irrespective of the background they came from, and some have come from very deprived backgrounds, they feel the power that I cooked, I nourished, I healed, and I passed on recipes to a generation. So yes, there is the conventional thing that, women, it is restrictive, you should not cook because this is what society expects from you. But I want to know why in every home in India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, there is a woman cooking at home. Why is there a man cooking in every kitchen? How is it that we lost power? And this is why it is so important for me. I first will occupy the space, and then I will talk about power. I will talk about gender bias, and I will use this moment on stage. You know, when the spotlight hits you, I'm not talking about myself. I read the lines for all those people who will never get on stage. I see them when I stand. Every time I speak, every platform I'm on, I am speaking for the home cook, the unrecognized, the other, the marginalized, the one that was never allowed to shine. We took away their food. We didn't even let them sit on the table often, that they remained this on the shadow behind walls. And yes, so for me, it is, I have twisted around because here, this is my claim to be acknowledged as powerful as a home cook.
So Asma, how do you make a decision? Like say the 9 cooks who are going to work for you. What is the process by which you select?
Well, I mean, I don't think I select them, they select me. So those who want, you know, there's this desire, they come in with a hunger. You see it in their eyes. You know, they want to work. And everybody who's working with me now, I've worked with for years. They started in my kitchen. You know, so literally it is that same team. And they've all worked part-time because they were all moms, or we never had enough work. We didn't have enough hours to give them. So some of them continue to be part-time nannies, part-time cooks. And this because we never could give them a lot of work. But now many of their children have grown up. So now we can do. One of the reasons I wanted to move was not just an economic thing, that it was not making sense, paying this kind of ridiculous rent in such a small place. I wanted to increase the team, but I also wanted to increase the regionality of what I was providing. So now with the deli, I've got vada pav, I've got sel roti, I've got kasika masu, I've got momos. I'm bringing in all the different dishes of the women on my team. They also have the right to cook the food of their grandmothers and nannies. You don't find this in restaurants. The chef, the face, and that is the only food that remains. You don't know who are the hands that are cooking. I want to recognize that on my menu, the people who are cooking, because they also have a history. They have a story too.
Excellent. In fact, the regionality is a lovely question. Back to Ravinder, and then I'll get to Vir soon. Ravinder, I was excited. I've been doing a little bit of research on Indian Ocean cuisine. Okay, so in some ways, looking at seas and oceans as connective spaces rather than separating territories, which is a standard way of thinking about nation state, territoriality, etc. Most exciting for me, was the name of your cookbook. And Jikoni. Could you explain a little, what it is for our audience, and B, highlight a couple of dishes that brings together what I think is kind of the Eastern Indian Ocean from, say, the Swahili coast to the Malabar coast in some ways?
Yeah, so I'll talk about the book first. So the title Jikoni is also the name of my restaurant, and it means kitchen in Swahili because I was born in Kenya, and you know, Kenya is it's a bewitching place that never quite leaves you. Even when you leave, it kind of stays with you, it grips you. You know, when you grow up with such sort of colossal sky and such colossal climate and backdrop, you just never leave it behind quite. So I wanted, when I opened my restaurant, to very much reflect part of my heritage. And I think also I had struggled in a way for many years, because I came here to this country when I was 7, to assimilate into a version of Englishness that had been presented to me. So from the correct way to speak, to the language that you were supposed to use, to all of these things. And I always felt like the sort of outlier in a way. And I think subconsciously, when I created Jikoni, I was creating a place where I felt that I could finally fit into, you know, where my language wasn't cauterized, where my experiences weren't cauterized, where my food was representative of truly who I was, both as an East African Indian, but also as a Londoner living in a very immigrant and diverse community in London that had fed into my food. So that is kind of what Jikoni is and what I wanted to do with the restaurant. And then, of course, that's filtered into the book. And I think the recipes in the book, so there are lots of recipes that come from very diverse places. But for example, one of our signatures is the Ponto Scotch egg. So we've taken two perennial favorites, the British Scotch egg, and then the Chinese Pontos, two sort of perennial favorites. And actually, when you bring them together, you're creating something better than the sum of their parts. And you're also making a very political statement that cultures can sit well together. And actually, when we celebrate the our differences, the richness of our differences, and the intricacies of our similarities, you're actually doing something good. You're doing something positive. But I really love recipes that have story, that have narrative. So there's a recipe in the book, for example, which is the paneer nudi with saag, and it comes with pickled lemon and pine nuts. And that was inspired by a documentary which I saw and I was fascinated by. And it charted the Italian dairy industry and how around about 2000 they were really struggling to get a workforce, for the kind of hours that you have to do, the little margins and all of that. People weren't interested in that country. So they decided to set up an immigrant program where they started getting North Indian farmers from my ancestral state, Punjab, to come to Italy to make cheese because they're experts with livestock. And this story just fascinated me, seeing these people, these men integrate into Italy. And I wondered, what would that taste like? What does that cuisine become? So we sort of made a nudi, which is an Italian thing. It's sort of like the filling of a pasta, normally pure cheese, normally made with ricotta. And instead, what we decided to do is make fresh paneer at the restaurant. We strain it off, we mix it with parmesan, and we bring together these very, very light dumplings, the nudi, and then we serve them with saag, which of course is a North Indian spinach sauce, and then lots more parmesan, cavolo nero, Italian greens, and pickled lemon and pine nuts. And really, for me, that dish represents the integration, and it's a love letter to those Punjabis who have gone and settled in Italy. And I find that fascinating.
Absolutely fascinating. In fact, that reminded me of today, in most cases, if you're going to have Parmigiano Reggiano, it is most probably processed by a Punjabi in Italy. And the other one that reminded me, I'm in New York right now. In the American case, we had a lovely example of early Sikh migration onto the West Coast. And they often, because they came at the time of miscegenation laws, so they often married, Sikh men often married Mexican women and created a hybrid cuisine out of, think about it, right? Makai ki roti and sarson ki saag. And you can pass it off as Mexican. And so, right? And so this fascinating coming together. Vir, I'm going to throw this to you. What I'm really excited is to see the creativity of Indianish food in London. It is much more difficult to find that in New York. New York is almost, I say, 20 years behind. And in terms of upscale, and this is not to fault people who are struggling to present Indian food. The New York audience is less adventurous in it. I'll give you an example. Only about 2% of Indian restaurants in New York City are upscale. Upscale meaning you have access to skilled people, you have access to good resources, about compared to say 12% of say Italian restaurants in New York City. That figure is reversed in London. In fact, in London, about 12% of Indian restaurants are upscale. Looking at this kind of London and Indian food, Vir, you have written widely about food in India, food globally, Indian food globally. What strikes you as what's going on in London?
Yeah, sure. I think London's an interesting example because Indian food has come in waves. The first Indian restaurants opened in the 19th century. They were open for sailors, for people like that. Then you had the whole invasion of the Bangladeshi curry house, to use the term they used to use then, which created, and it's extraordinary because these were people who came from East Bengal, which is one of the world's great cuisines, who turned their backs on that cuisine and made a version of Punjabi cuisine, which no Punjabi would recognize. So what you really have is Bengalis making Punjabi food for white people and the creation of a cuisine that's pretty much unknown on the subcontinent. After that, you have many other developments, one of which is, as you said, the upscale restaurant. In the early days in London, the upscale restaurants were in areas with high rents, and the only way they could pay those rents was by selling wine. And the only way they could get those wine markups was by doing fancy Frenchified food served in fancy plates and served pretty much as if it were not Indian food. Many of the chefs who ran those restaurants are still around, and many of them are extraordinarily talented chefs, but economics was such that they had to fall into that pattern. What's happened since then, and that's at least partly because the immigrant experience has changed. Children of immigrants have grown up, people who have Indian origins.
Ooh, that's a lovely sound of the train going by somewhere. Vir, did you get cut off? Give him a minute.
I think
Okay.
Vir is frozen, so perhaps you want to continue, Chris, and come.
Yes, exactly. So in this case, Asma, kind of, how do you respond to, in a sense, looking at Ravinder's kitchen and cookbook and yours? How would you compare, not in some ways what is better or what is worse, but in a sense, the vision, say, between your vision and say Ravinder's vision? What might be the difference in terms of representing Indian food? And like, I'll give you an example. I was kind of, I consider myself a bit jaded now, but I was startled where I think, Ravinder, you have this, let's see, which one? Sorry, audience, I'm looking at Ravinder's book here. A beautiful book, where you have I think, pani puri with oysters in it. That was startling to me. And I said, whoa. And in some ways, it also reminded me a bit of Asma's kind of mashing of, say, Mughal haute cuisine, and, as she says, street foods of Calcutta. So in some ways, Asma, a little reflection on what's going on your cuisines between the high and low, okay, between this region and that region. That's kind of fascinating to me.
I think that, in India, if you go out you leave three villages, the way they baghar the dal is different.
Changes.
So actually, there is no Indian cuisine. And even within regions, there are religious, caste, all kinds of, differences between people, that people living next to each other would be eating completely different food. So I think that, actually,
I'll give you my example. My two grandmothers, one Odia, one Bengali, okay? Less than a kilometer apart, totally different food.
Yeah. And the whole thing is that, so I have actually had the good fortune to have grown up in India. I have no misunderstanding. I don't listen to what people's perception is of food. I feel it from my heart. And I think the most blessed thing is to eat. As we say, Alhamdulillah, we eat. I come from a country where people die of hunger. I come from a country where people are lynched for what they're eating. So those are shameful things. I think the fact that you celebrate food, that you cook for others, whether you put oysters in your pani puri or not, that doesn't bother me. The fact that you actually being joyful about food, you are giving part of yourself. This is Ravinder reflecting part of herself. And that makes me smile. I celebrate that your heart is big enough to be brave, to be yourself, it's very brave to be able to stand up and cook for yourself. You're not trying to be, follow the path. Every kali dal that is made in an Indian restaurant in this country tastes the same. And you know why? Because every chef almost cooking in London restaurants was trained in Taj or Oberoi's. And this classic training of 5-star restaurants, which is, I have to say, incredible. But this stamp on the cooks, where they come in, there's a sameness in their food. And then they try and play around by playing around with other cuisines. That's not what Ravinder is doing. And this is why I love it, because she's just being herself. I know her story. I know her very well. And also, this is something that is not contrived. It is that contrived cuisine, which is, where it is a lot of faff and edible flowers and micro herbs and put in there, and, where you separate the food, but you've taken out the soul of a dish. That is my problem with food that is being played around with. I think, we come from a country where food is given to gods. And as a Muslim, I can tell you, we have niyaz, we give out, distribute food to the poor people. It is part of our thing. Death, everything, death, birth, marriages. Food is central to that. I want to bring back the respect to my food, because the problem that has happened as an immigrant is food and culture has been separated. And this means that my food is taken away. You can't have my food if you don't have me. You've got to accept and respect me, my hands, my brown skin, my name, my accent. You eat the food because you understand who I am. You cannot get up from my table and disrespect me and everybody who looks like me. And the problem is cultural appropriation of food is all of this is possible. You can't have my food. You cannot have my music. You cannot have my clothes. You cannot take away things of me if you do it without honor. And this is the problem. And I think that it's very important that, restaurants come on where they are proud, as she is, of what Ravinder is doing. There's a sense of pride and identity. She can explain what she's doing, because we need to tell our stories. And this is why, unless we tell our stories, people will tell our stories for us. And that is very good.
Perfect segue. Ravinder, I'm going to throw it back to Vir. Welcome back, Vir. Sorry we lost you. Yeah, so you can finish your thinking. We'll have a couple of minutes before we get into the audience.
I was only going to make one brief point, which is that the reason Indian food is so different now in England is that Indians are more visible, or people from South Asia via Africa otherwise are more visible. A lot of the chefs, people like Ravinder, for instance, have grown up in this country, in the UK. They understand the environment. The Sethis, who run one of the largest Indian food groups in London, are also people who grew up in England. They understand the clientele. It's very different from, say, 15 years ago, when you had people who'd worked for the Taj or the Oberoi, who came to London and ran what were essentially hotel restaurants and hoped that they would work. There's now an independent London scene when it comes to Indian food, which is exciting, which is creative, and which I think gives you some of the best Indian food in the world.
Vir, on that, you have said somewhere, I think it's in your pantry, the Indian pantry book, talking about India. You say our chefs now benchmark themselves against global standards. Could you give an example of like the scene that's going on in urban Indian context that is probably cross-fertilizing across this global flows?
Well, I think what's happened in India is that the internet and satellite television have both changed everything. It began with satellite television and shows like, funnily enough, MasterChef Australia, not because people were very invested in the three judges, but because people like Heston Blumenthal came on and did demonstrations on MasterChef Australia. And Indians had never heard of Heston. They were amazed by the things he was doing. Because of the internet, people go onto YouTube, they see videos, they watch Top Chef. You can go to a restaurant in Delhi and the guy will say, I have invented this dessert. And you know that he's seen the video of the original dessert in Alenia and Chicago, and he's just copying it. Many people think that's bad. I don't think that's bad. I think Indian chefs now have looked at the whole world. They've learned whatever they can from the world. Some of it, yes, is copying. Some of it is not very creative. But hey, that's how these things begin. You find out what the world is doing. You try and be like them. We had Asma coming to Bombay to cook last year. And one of the organizations I'm a part of, we tried to get as many great chefs as we can. We had Mauro Colagreco, whose restaurant is #1 in the world's 50 best. We had originally Heston coming in December. That hasn't worked out. Massimo coming in January, pre-pandemic. You have the world's best chefs coming. They sit with Indian chefs. They talk to Indian chefs. They understand Indian food. For instance, great Spanish chef Andoni came to Delhi, came without a menu, stayed for a few days, looked at ingredients, invented a menu on the spot. Indian chefs see that. They benchmark themselves against that. And as you know, one of our problems with Indian food has been that we don't care that much about ingredients. All of that is changing because the sort of global benchmarking I'm talking about.
This is fantastic. In fact, I see it as you're saying, I see it almost as peer review and citation of each other's work, right? If you're going to have a professional network, and this is not so much copying as in citation. Vir, we're going to move into the audience questions now. The first question is for you, for Vir. With the pandemic hitting the hotel and food industry the most, how does this system best adapt to the rapidly changed economic landscape? How do they stay afloat? And in fact, Asma and Ravinder, you can also take a kind of a response to that question a bit. How are you dealing with what looks like a catastrophic crisis? We'll start with Vir.
Well, it's much worse in India, Krishnendu, than it is in the West, because in the West, many governments have offered all kinds of assistance. In India, governments have offered the opposite of assistance. They've done everything possible to make life difficult for restaurants. What's happened in many restaurants is that the waiters, the kitchen staff, people like that who were never from Delhi have been forced to make the trek back to their villages. Some of them have got COVID in the process. A lot of them have lost everything. They've lost their income. And that's the untold part of the restaurant story in India. And it's very sad and it's very tragic. The part that we talk about is the restaurateurs themselves, many of whom are going bust. Landlords are not being as accommodating as people had hoped. Restaurants are struggling to survive by using things like delivery, which is finally picking up. Delivery now is 70% of pre-pandemic levels. A delivery at 70% is not really enough for a restaurant to survive. We're supposed to be opening up now. More and more restaurants are opening up. But my guess is something like 40% will close. It's a bad time.
I see. And that's the expectation in New York City. Anywhere between 20 to 30% are probably not going to come back. Asma and Ravinder, do you want to kind of talk a little about how you are kind of surviving through this phase? And then the next question is for Ravinder. I'm going to pose this question and then you can decide how to respond. Nayanika asks, would you describe yourself as someone who is proudly inauthentic? Ravinder?
I'd certainly describe my. Do you want me to answer about the pandemic first, and then
yes,
come on
let's
to
do
that?
that. Let's do that.
So I think, firstly, my huge empathy to my friends and colleagues in India and the US for what they're going through, and actually, I think our government here has responded fairly well to this situation in terms of support, like furlough and loans from the banks and things like that. But I think we really have stopped as a restaurant and thought, how do we stay relevant in the face of this crisis, and how do we turn this around for ourselves? Obviously, it was very scary. Our restaurant's only 3.5 years old, and we'd sort of hit our sweet spot. We were kind of doing everything was really going along very well, and then this came like a bolt out of the blue. And for us, it's been very much about using this opportunity as an opportunity to re-engineer the world around ourselves, to try and make it a better one to be part of in terms of looking at the climate. So looking at for over a year, all our energy has been green, so that's great. We launched a delivery service called Comfort and Joy, which is sort of globally inspired vegetarian food from all around the world, inspired globally. So with that, we kind of really thought about our packaging. We were pretty horrified to see the amount of plastic that was suddenly being used by restaurants again. And we took our time to really research and look at where can we get packaging which is completely 100% compostable, so home compostable. So we've managed to now get packaging which you can literally throw onto your compost heap, and in 90 days it's soil. Looking at our suppliers, shortening our supply chain so that we know that the producers that we're working with are farming responsibly, looking after the environment. How do we feed into our community? All of those things I think are more important now than ever. And I think, again, you have to, I think the restaurants that will survive it are the restaurants that have a genuine narrative, and actually your business has to be much more than just about making money. And I think it's never been that for us. It's always been about how do we make sure that every pound that's spent in our business is somehow positive or has something regenerative attached to it. And I think we're focusing even more and more on that now. And I think the businesses that I look up to and respect, like Asma, are also really, really focused into that. So I think that's that. And then the question about being proudly inauthentic.
I'll just keep it very short. I want to move to Asma after this. There's a question.
I have tangled roots. I come from many, many places. And even when you look at my Indian heritage, there is so much Persian influence on Indian food. So I think I'm a sum of many, many things and many influences, and not just my genetic roots, but also the people I surround myself with who are so diverse. So I'm a product of all of those things.
In fact, I was cooking from your book, and what struck me was how Persian some of it is, like rose water and use of nuts and then saffron and etc. Asma, the question to you is: as an immigrant in England, you have said that food brought you home. Which of your dishes would you say most powerfully embodies your childhood, and why?
It has to be paratha. Because I think that this idea that, if, for most people in the West, they can't understand. But for all of us who grew up, paratha was an entire meal. As a child, you got paratha with sprinkles of sugar on it, or jam if you were very lucky, kisan jam, mixed fruit jam. And then your life was complete. You had this paratha. So, for that is what symbolizes. And I think, very briefly, I just want to say about the pandemic. I hope that it will make people more conscious of whose restaurant they go to, because some of the especially established male chefs and male restaurateurs behaved appallingly at the pandemic. So I think the time is now when you can choose which restaurant you want to go to. Just as Ravinder was saying, go to one who was responsible, who didn't abandon the staff and actually cared about what was happening and has given back into the community. Those are the people who we need to support when everybody opens up again.
Asma, 2 minutes. The childhood dish that embodies. Do you want to kind of Vir? Do you want to, in some ways, pull together some of these commentary? We have 2 more minutes.
No, just mainly to make the point that food has now become about many things. It's become about identity. In the case of people like Ravinder who are in England, it's about pulling together many different identities to speak in a language that is rooted in her own ethnic origins, but is also international. For someone like Asma, food is a means to an end. She said to me once in an interview that when I die, I don't want it said on my grave, here lies Asma Khan, who was a cook. I want it said, here lies Asma Khan, who tried to make the world a better place. She's used food for its power, for its ability to empower other people. I think that's the power of food. It isn't any longer about, say, Gujaratis or Bengalis cooking their own food. The world is much too international for that. It's about the world coming together. And in the case of many chefs, it's about using it for the power of good.
Lovely. I think we can leave it at that. Any last quick thoughts before I throw it back to Ankur to close the session?
I just wanted to say that, it's actually this creative pause of the pandemic has stopped the wheels of hospitality. And when we restart, I think that we need those who are thinking where the food becomes more meaningful, where it is more about, the roots of food. So we should take this chance to actually discuss this. This is great that we had this opportunity to have this conversation, because I think that this is really what we need to do. We need to talk more with people who care about food, but care about how food is made as well.
I would love a longer conversation. This kind of time flew totally. Ravinder, any quick thoughts?
I think I completely agree with Asma. I want people to remember that every time you sit down to a meal, you're not just looking at a food chain, you're actually looking at a chain of humanity. There is a invisible humanity present around you, from the person who grew your food, picked it, the chef who's cooked it with such care and love, to the person who served it to you. And people often come to restaurants and say, wow, that's expensive. You're not paying for the food, you're paying for the humanity that served it to you.
Lovely note to end this. Thanks, Vir. Thanks, Asma. Thanks, Ravinder. I'm going to cook through your whole book and then return back to you.
Look forward
There you
to
are,
it.
Ankur. Yes, Ankur. Ankur, it's yours now.
Thank you so much, Ravinder, Asma, Vir, and Krishnendu. Thank you so much for being excellent speakers, for being part of the JLF London 2020 family, and hope to have you all part of our festival in physical, in reality, in flesh and blood in 2021 in London. Thank you once again. And thank you all for watching and being such a great audience. We thank our partners, the Aga Khan Foundation UK, and our patron, the Murthy Family Foundation, for their support. Our last session now is our finale debate that will begin shortly. The age of iconoclasm. B. Rowlett, Edward Chancellor, Nick Robbins, Swapan Das Gupta, William Dalrymple, and Zarir Masani, moderated by Mukulika Banerjee. Britain is full of statues of men once regarded as imperial heroes, many of whom are responsible for acts of loot and pillage that would now be classified as war crimes. This house believes the time has now come to remove them to a museum of colonialism. Please do stay online and join us for an exciting finale. We now present to you a short reading from the Jaipur Writers Short Series featuring Shubh Priya.
Hi, I'm Shubha Priya and I write as Shupri. This is my book called Whimsical Brew. It's a concoction of humorous visual poems for grown-ups like us, and it looks something like this. Now I'm going to read this poem. It's called Why Didn't They Ask Me Before They Assembled My Body Parts, huh? No dinosaur nor Darwin could see what shape we take as we evolved from sea and swamp and every murky lake. We lost our tails and our claws as we became upright. If I had seen me then, I bet I would have got a fright. You and I were hairy beasts thumping on our chests, stealing skins from animals and picking lice infests. Yet we had 3 billion years to iron out each kink, to make our bodies beautiful. But did we stop to think? If only we had had the sense to evolve with flair, we'd have asked to plant our heads with toughened Teflon hair. How much neater we would be without our gooey insides. No menopause, no PMS at mercy of the tides. We'd make sure the meat we are is inedible mutton. Our hair would age from grey to black like Benjamin Button. We'd retract those dangly bits. Our necks would never turkey. Our collagen would stay intact and boobs forever perky. We'd make sure to separate ejection from erection. Entertainment areas not so close to the toilet section. Every body part would have doors that make it easy to inspect and fix it up. A doctor's job just breezy. It's not too late to petition as we jointly strive to improve the human race by 5035. Homo sapiens 10.1. Improvements must be made, just like all the bugs we fix with every app upgrade. I think a certain future we must avoid to guarantee we'll morph into a non-snorting, non-burping, non-farting, non-shitting android.
Welcome to JLF at the British Library. We now have our much loved closing debate on what do we do with imperial statues, one of the great issues of our time.